The wind howled relentlessly across the snow-covered plains, but inside the cabin it was a different world. Built with unconventional methods and mocked by those who didn't understand, the structure stood resilient, a symbol of quiet innovation and unexpected survival. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this resonate with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more remarkable than this one. It wasn't supposed to work. At least, that's what everyone said. Even the other trappers, those who had survived harsh winters in the Rocky Mountains and built their own cabins with time-honored methods, couldn't stop laughing when they saw Simon's new shelter. They'd built their cabins with practical efficiency in mind. Quick, simple structures that would keep the wind and rain out. Nothing more. But Simon built a cabin that no one could understand, not even the man himself at first. He'd come to the mountains years ago after escaping the crowded streets of New York, hoping for a quiet life far from civilization. But that peace had been elusive. Grizzly bears had destroyed cabins. Harsh winters had driven men mad. And the cabins built by those before him were never quite right. Not for the extreme conditions he faced. Simon wasn't a carpenter by trade. He was a fisherman and an occasional woodworker. But that winter, he became something else. Obsessed. Obsessed with creating something that could withstand the brutal elements of the wilderness and the constant threats of predators. There was something about this place, about the isolation, that made him feel more connected to the land. And now, it seemed, he could feel the land testing him. He had studied the old cabins, trying to find their weaknesses. The notched corners, the flimsy doors, the gaps in the walls that let in the cold. It was clear to him that these cabins weren't just poorly built, they were designed for comfort, not survival. And the more he thought about it, the more the question gnawed at him. Why should a man go to the wilderness to die by something as simple as the construction of his home? Simon decided he would try something new. With a bit of salvaged timber and some iron brackets he'd bargained for in town, he started constructing the cabin from the ground up. He thought of it not as a shelter, but as an armor. The door, the corners, the roof, all had to be capable of surviving not just the seasons, but anything nature could throw at it. The first night he finished, Simon stepped back and looked at the structure with pride. It wasn't much to look at. Rudimentary in design, with a heavy slanted roof and walls built with solid overlapping logs. But he knew it was sturdy. He could feel the weight of the construction in his bones, the firm, unyielding structure against the elements outside. That night, as the wind began to howl across the ridges, Simon felt a sense of peace. Maybe this was the home he'd been looking for all along. But peace wouldn't come so easily. The wilderness had other ideas. The night after Simon completed the last of his cabin, he sat by the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. He could hear the wind picking up outside, a sound that had become familiar in these mountains. It was the kind of wind that carried with it the promise of snow and the heavy weight of the cold. Simon had grown accustomed to it over the past few months, but tonight something felt different. There was a stillness, a quiet before the storm. He stood up and moved toward the door. The wooden door, heavy and reinforced, had been the last element of the cabin to be completed. Simon had spent hours shaping the planks, fitting them together in a way that no bear, no man could break through. At least, that was the hope. His hand rested on the door handle, and for a moment he thought he heard something. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. It was the low growl of something large, something nearby. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Stepping back from the door, Simon grabbed his rifle from the corner. His heart rate quickened. Bears were common in these parts, but rarely did they come close enough to a cabin to test it. Tonight, however, was different. He could sense it in the air. Something was stirring outside, moving through the snow. He moved to one of the small windows, carefully peering out. His breath fogged the glass, and he wiped it away with the sleeve of his coat. In the dim light of the cabin's interior, Simon could make out the dark silhouette of a large shape moving toward the door. A bear. The creature moved slowly but deliberately, its massive paws pressing into the snow, the claws dragging along the ground. It was a grizzly, no doubt. Simon's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment his cabin would either prove itself or fall short. He watched as the bear approached the door, its nose sniffing the air. Simon held his breath, waiting for the inevitable. Would the door hold? Would the cabin hold? Or would all his work, all his effort, prove to be in vain? The bear circled the cabin, its movements methodical. It tested the door first, pushing against the wood with its enormous weight. Simon felt the cabin shift slightly, but the door held. The walls, solid and unyielding, didn't bend under the weight. The corners, where so many other cabins had failed, stood firm. The bear, frustrated, moved to the corners, testing the logs with its claws. Again nothing gave. It moved to the window, reaching up with its claws, trying to pry open the shutters. The window was high, out of reach. Simon had thought of everything, but had he thought of this? The bear grunted, its claws scratching against the logs, but after several long minutes it seemed to give up. Simon could hear it retreating into the night, a low growl fading into the distance. He stood there, rifle in hand, heart pounding in his chest. His cabin had passed the test. It had survived. The storm outside was fierce, but inside the cabin Simon felt something else, a quiet, unspoken victory. This wasn't just a cabin anymore, it was a fortress. Winter in the mountains was an unforgiving season. It didn't care for the strength of a man's cabin or the might of his will. It simply came, relentlessly, pushing its way through every crack, every weakness, until even the strongest of men could feel the cold creeping in. But Simon had prepared for this. His cabin was more than just a shelter now. It was his fortress. The first snowstorm arrived late in November, and it came with a fury that Simon had not seen before. The wind screamed through the ridges, sending gusts of snow into the air like a storm of white knives. Inside, the fire burned brightly, but the cold still managed to press against the windows and door, causing the cabin to creak and groan under the weight of the storm. Yet Simon remained undeterred. The cabin held firm, its thick walls keeping the wind and snow outside. As the days passed, Simon's thoughts shifted inward. The mountain was alive with danger during the winter months. Elk, deer, and other creatures were forced to move lower down the slopes in search of food. The bears had long since gone into hibernation, but the wolves were always a threat. He knew the dangers of being alone in the mountains, especially now that the snow would make travel even more treacherous. But he was prepared. The pantry was stocked with dried meat, salted fish, and enough beans and corn to last him through the worst of the season. His traps were set in the nearby forests, and he had fashioned snowshoes from the salvaged timber he'd cut earlier in the year, just in case he needed to venture out for supplies. One evening, as he sat by the fire, the howling wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it was a living thing, pressing its cold fingers against the walls. He had grown used to it by now, but tonight there was something different in the air. It felt like something was coming. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was testing him again. Hours passed, and as Simon sat watching the fire dance, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. He froze. The sound was out of place. Nothing had ever knocked at his door before. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard another soul since he had arrived in the mountains, not since that first fateful winter. Who could be out here in this storm? Cautiously, Simon rose from his chair and approached the door. His rifle was already within reach, but there was no need for it yet. The knock came again, louder this time. Simon's instincts told him to be ready for anything. He opened the door, his eyes scanning the blizzard outside. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, through the snow, a figure appeared, staggering, hunched, and wrapped in layers of wet furs. It was a man, though, barely recognizable. "Help! Help me, please," the man croaked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Simon didn't hesitate. He reached out and grabbed the man's arm, pulling him inside before the storm could claim him. The stranger collapsed by the fire, his breathing shallow and labored. Simon took a deep breath and closed the door. The mountain had brought him this challenge, a test not of his cabin's strength, but of his own resolve. The man was older than Simon, his face lined with the rough weather of the mountains, his beard tangled and frozen. His clothes were soaked through, caked with ice and snow, but it was the look in his eyes that struck Simon the most. There was a depth to them, a sense of fear and desperation that only the wilderness could breed. The storm outside raged harder, and Simon knew that this man was lucky to have arrived when he did. He moved quickly, pulling the stranger into a chair near the fire and covering him with a blanket. Simon's instincts kicked in. He poured hot water into a cup and handed it to the man, who accepted it with trembling hands. "Drink this, it'll warm you," Simon said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "What happened to you?" The man's hands shook as he sipped the water, his lips cracked and dry. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes drifted to the fire, as if trying to gather the strength to speak. Then he cleared his throat. "I was traveling with a group," the stranger began, his voice weak but steadying. "We were heading west, looking for supplies, food, furs, anything to survive the winter, but we got lost. The storm hit us hard and we didn't make it. I was separated from the others." Simon nodded silently, his eyes narrowing. He had heard of people getting lost in the mountains before. The storm had claimed many who thought they could outrun it or outsmart it. "Where are they now?" Simon asked. The stranger looked down at his hands. "They're gone. I'm the only one left." His voice cracked, and Simon could see the sorrow in his eyes. He didn't need to ask how the others had died. The man's gaze spoke volumes. There was no mistaking the grief that lingered in the air between them. The fire crackled in the silence, its warmth filling the room. Simon's gaze shifted to the door. He didn't know why the man had appeared at his doorstep or why the storm had brought him here, but the wilderness had a way of throwing strange things into your path. Sometimes those things could save your life. Other times they could end it. But Simon wasn't about to turn away a fellow soul in need. "You're safe now," Simon said, his voice calm but firm. "Rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness had brought more than just this man to his doorstep. The storm wasn't over. And Simon knew the mountain had a way of revealing its tests one step at a time. The following morning the storm had not relented. The winds howled, the snow never ceased its descent, and the world outside Simon's cabin was a white blur. The stranger, whose name turned out to be Matthew, slept fitfully by the fire, his body shivering despite the warmth. Simon moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and checking the supplies. He had always kept things in order, but now, with the stranger's presence, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Matthew was a man of few words, his demeanor hollow, his gaze often distant. He spoke little of his past or the group he had been with. Every time Simon tried to pry, Matthew would either change the subject or fall silent, as if something was gnawing at him. But Simon wasn't one to press. The wilderness taught a man to mind his own business, especially when the cold could steal your breath away and the night could steal your life. But there was something in Matthew's eyes, something Simon couldn't ignore. The desperation, yes, but also fear. Fear of more than just the storm. It was a fear that came from something deeper, something far darker than the elements. As the days passed, Simon kept to his routine. He checked his traps, reinforced the cabin's door and windows, and kept the fire burning. Matthew, on the other hand, grew increasingly withdrawn. He spent more time staring at the fire or staring out the small window, as if waiting for something or someone. One night, after the fire had dimmed and the silence was broken only by the crackling of the embers, Simon sat down beside him. "You're not from around here," Simon said, his voice low and careful. Matthew looked at him but didn't answer immediately. The cabin creaked with the wind outside, and for a moment there was nothing but the fire between them. "I've seen a lot of places," Matthew said finally, his voice almost a whisper, "but none like this. It's different here. Feels like the land itself is watching." Simon frowned. It wasn't like Matthew to speak in such a way. He had heard others say similar things, how the land, the mountains, could drive a man to madness. It was the isolation, the endless cold, the constant danger, but Simon had never believed it. "Watching?" Simon asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. Matthew nodded, his eyes distant again. "I don't know, but there's something about this place. I keep feeling like I'm being followed." He paused, looking over his shoulder, as if someone were standing just behind him. "Like I'm not alone." Simon's chest tightened. He had never been one for superstition, but something in Matthew's words struck a chord. He had been alone for so long that the idea of another person on the mountain, a presence, unsettled him. Before Simon could respond, there was a loud thud from outside, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy dragging against the cabin's walls. Simon stood abruptly, his hand reaching for his rifle. Matthew stiffened, eyes wide with panic. The storm outside raged, but this sound was different. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something that had come for them. The night's silence had been broken by something more than the wind and snow. It was a sound unlike any Simon had heard before, but it was unmistakable. Heavy, dragging steps, as though something, or someone, was moving along the perimeter of the cabin. Simon's heart rate quickened, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he moved toward the door. Matthew, now wide-eyed and trembling, was already on his feet, clutching his coat tightly around his chest. His fear was palpable, almost suffocating. Simon glanced at him quickly before turning his attention back to the door. It was not a time for questions. His instincts were screaming at him to act, not think. "Stay back," Simon whispered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. He moved to the door, his boots heavy against the floor, and cautiously peeked through the small window. The storm outside had intensified, but the shadows were moving, shifting in the swirling snow. He could see nothing clearly, no figures, no shapes, just the thickening darkness. The scraping sound continued, now closer, much closer. Simon's hand tightened around the rifle's stock. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for whatever would come next. The scraping stopped. Then a low grunt followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scratching at the logs. A bear, it had to be a bear. But Simon's mind raced with another thought. The bears should all be hibernating. They should not be out in these conditions. Matthew stepped forward, his voice a whisper. "What is it? What's out there?" Simon didn't respond. His instincts told him not to speak, not to make a sound. Every noise, every shift in the wind could alert whatever was out there to their presence. And the thought of it, knowing they were here, inside, made his blood run cold. The creature outside circled the cabin. Simon's breath was steady, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. It wasn't a bear, not by the way it moved. It was too deliberate, too cautious. It had a purpose. He stepped back from the door, his rifle still at the ready. The creature's movements were slow now, like it was assessing the cabin, learning its weaknesses. "Stay quiet," Simon whispered. He motioned for Matthew to move further away from the door to the far side of the cabin, out of view. Matthew obeyed, his face pale, lips trembling. Simon moved toward the window again, watching the creature's every move. The wind had died down, leaving the night still, almost suffocatingly so. It was then that Simon saw it, a flash of pale fur. No bear had fur like that. No mountain creature moved with that level of intelligence. This wasn't just an animal. This was something more. Simon's heart dropped. It wasn't just the storm outside that was testing him now. It was something darker, something far more dangerous than even the wilderness itself. The creature outside was not just watching the cabin, it was waiting. Simon's pulse thrummed in his ears, louder than the wind howling outside. His eyes, fixed on the window, tried to pierce through the snowstorm to catch any sign of movement. The creature outside had gone silent, but Simon could still feel it, lurking just beyond his cabin's walls, as though it were watching and waiting. The stillness was more unnerving than the noise had been. He dared not make a sound. Every instinct screamed at him to stay perfectly still, to not alert whatever was out there. Matthew, trembling in the corner, had gone eerily quiet. The storm outside raged on, but inside the air had thickened with tension. The heat from the fire seemed to dissipate, replaced by an unnatural chill that crept into Simon's bones. The scraping noise had stopped, but Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something was pressing against the walls of his cabin, testing its strength. He could imagine the creature's claws, thick and powerful, dragging across the wood, seeking an opening. Bears, wolves, they didn't move like this. They were quick, but this thing moved with purpose, with an intelligence that made Simon uneasy. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Simon dared not move closer to the door again. Instead, he crouched low near the fire, rifle still in hand, his eyes darting between the window and the door, scanning every shadow for a clue, a shift in movement that might reveal what was outside. Matthew's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. What if it knows we're here? Simon's eyes flickered toward him, then back to the window. It already knows, he murmured. And it's waiting, watching. The realization settled heavily in Simon's chest. Whatever was out there had been circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The storm had masked its movements, allowed it to come closer. But the storm also worked in their favor. As fierce as it was, the blizzard hid them from view. Still, Simon knew the creature wouldn't leave. It was patient, far more patient than a bear. Outside, the snow continued to swirl, driven by gusts of wind, but the silence had returned. The creature, whatever it was gone, at least for now. Simon let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the feeling of unease never left. He knew the storm was not the only thing testing him anymore. The wilderness had become something darker, a force with eyes that he could not escape. "What do we do now?" Matthew asked, his voice more desperate. "We wait," Simon replied, but his words felt hollow, as if they carried little weight against the growing uncertainty. They were waiting for the storm to pass, but they were also waiting for the unknown to make its next move. Simon stood, moving toward the door. He couldn't just sit there hoping the creature would go away. It wouldn't. It couldn't. There was no escaping it. Not now. Not here. The cabin felt small now. Every creak in the walls, every gust of wind, seemed magnified in the thick silence. Simon had seen enough of the wild to know when danger was imminent. He'd been in the mountains long enough to understand the ways of the wilderness. But this was something different. Whatever was out there circling his home wasn't a predator in the traditional sense. It was something else, something intelligent, something that understood the art of patience and the art of fear. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but Simon refused to relax. Every movement he made felt like it could provoke the creature into action. The fire burned low, but Simon didn't want to add more wood. The flickering light was his only source of comfort. Too much light, too much movement, might betray their presence. The small, dim glow cast long shadows across the cabin, making the space feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. Matthew was in the corner, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his arms wrapped around them as though he could shut out the world. He hadn't spoken since the last time he asked what they should do. Simon had given him no answer, not because he didn't know, but because there was nothing more to say. The wilderness had changed. The rules had changed. This wasn't the wilderness Simon had known. Outside, the snow was now a thick, suffocating blanket. Simon knew that if the creature decided to strike, there would be no warning. The wind would mask its movements. The storm would hide it from view, but for now, it seemed content to wait. A distant noise broke the silence, shuffling, like something dragging through the snow. Simon's heart raced, and he moved to the window in an instant, his rifle now pressed tight against his side. He looked out, searching through the curtain of snowflakes. The dark shapes of the trees were barely visible, hunched beneath the weight of the snow. And then he saw it, a flash of pale fur moving quickly and silently through the storm. It was just a shape, a silhouette against the whiteout, but Simon could see enough to know it wasn't a bear. It was too nimble, too agile. It moved past the cabin, vanishing into the storm. Simon stood frozen, his eyes wide. It had been so quick, so silent. Was it the same creature that had been circling earlier? He couldn't be sure, but something told him it was. And it wasn't alone. Matthew stirred behind him. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Simon didn't answer right away. He had to process the sight, what he had just witnessed. The pale fur, the strange, fluid movements. It was unlike anything he had seen in the mountains before. Whatever it wasn't a typical predator. It was something else entirely. "We need to leave," Matthew whispered. "Now, before it comes. Back." Simon didn't respond immediately. The creature was close, too close, and now it knew they were there. Simon's mind raced as he stared into the swirling whiteout, his fingers tight around the rifle. The sight of the creature's fleeting shadow had sent a chill down his spine. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't a bear or any animal he knew. This thing was intelligent, deliberate, and it was getting closer. Matthew's voice quivered behind him. "We can't stay here, Simon. We have to go. Now." The urgency in his voice was hard to ignore, but Simon wasn't so sure. The cabin had been his haven, his fortress against the elements, the one place he thought he could rely on. Now it felt like a trap, a cage with no way out. "We can't just leave," Simon said, his voice calmer than he felt. "Not yet." Matthew's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He had seen it too, the pale fur, the stealthy movements, the eerie silence. He was right. The cabin, with its strong walls and reinforced doors, had been the thing that separated them from the wilderness. But now it seemed more like a tomb. "We don't have a choice," Matthew insisted. "It's coming for us. Whatever it is, it knows we're here. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." Simon could feel the weight of Matthew's words, but he resisted the panic creeping in. If they left now, they'd be vulnerable. They'd be exposed in the middle of a blizzard, with no shelter and no clear path. The only way forward was to confront whatever was out there. Running would only make them prey. Still, there was something inside him that pushed back against the idea of abandoning his home, the home he had built from the ground up. The wilderness had taken so much from him already, his partner, his peace, and now it seemed intent on taking the only thing he had left, his survival. "I'm not leaving," Simon said firmly, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "We'll wait it out. We'll stay here and fight if we have to." Matthew's lips trembled, but he didn't argue. He knew the logic, even if he couldn't shake the terror gnawing at him. They were cornered now, both by the storm and whatever stalked the land outside. A noise from outside shattered the stillness, a loud thud, followed by a scraping sound. Simon's heart leaped into his throat. It was close, too close. He grabbed Matthew by the arm. "Get your things," Simon said urgently. "Now. If we leave everything behind. If we stay, we'll make our stand here." Matthew's face twisted with fear. "But we can't survive against that thing. What if we fight or we die here?" Simon interrupted. "If we stay, we fortify. If we leave, we die in the open." Simon didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his rifle, checking the ammunition, and moved toward the door. They had to prepare for whatever was coming. The storm had given them a moment, a reprieve, but it wouldn't last forever. Matthew stood frozen for a moment, and then, with a reluctant nod, he followed Simon's lead. The wind outside howled, as if mocking their decision. The creature had sensed them. It knew they were inside, and it wasn't done yet. The cabin, once a fortress, now felt like a battlefield. Simon moved swiftly, reinforcing every window, every door. The walls had been built to withstand the harshest storms, but no amount of wood and iron could guarantee safety from the unknown. Whatever stalked the land outside had already tested the cabin once, and it wouldn't be long before it returned to finish what it had started. Matthew worked silently beside Simon, his eyes darting nervously between the windows, the door, the walls. His fear was palpable, but he had no choice but to trust Simon. The man had survived here for years, on his own, building and maintaining this cabin. If there was anyone who could face this creature and make it out alive, it was Simon. The scraping sound from outside had stopped for now, but the tension in the air was thick. The wind, which had been howling relentlessly, had died down, leaving only the sound of Simon and Matthew's hurried movements. Simon took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. There was no time to second-guess. Every second counted. "Let's go over the plan," Simon said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Matthew looked up, eyes wide. "What plan? We don't have a plan. We're just going to fight that thing out there?" Simon didn't answer immediately. His mind raced through every possible outcome, every detail of what he knew. The creature outside was no ordinary predator. It had intelligence, cunning. It had been circling the cabin for hours, waiting for a chance to strike. The only way to survive was to outsmart it. "We'll make our stand inside," Simon said finally. "We've got the high ground here. The cabin is our advantage. If it gets inside, we shoot to kill. If it doesn't, we wait it out until the storm breaks." Matthew swallowed hard, but nodded. "All right, but if it comes through that door—" "We'll be ready," Simon said, cutting him off. He checked the rifle once more, ensuring it was loaded. "Stay low. Stay quiet. We can't give it any reason to rush." The door creaked slightly in the wind, as if echoing the tension inside. Simon could almost feel the weight of the creature outside, its eyes on them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the walls again. This time it was louder, closer. The creature was circling the cabin again, testing its defenses. Simon motioned for Matthew to move away from the door. They were running out of time. The creature wasn't just waiting, it was preparing for something. With one last glance at Matthew, Simon took a steadying breath. Whatever came next, they would face it together. No more running. Days had passed since Simon had reinforced the cabin, each one stretching as the tension outside thickened, like the snow drifts piling up against the walls. The creature had been circling the cabin, never far but never close enough to strike. The wind howled relentlessly outside, but there was an eerie stillness in the cabin itself, as if the mountain itself held its breath. Inside, Simon had made sure they were prepared. He had checked and rechecked their supplies, their weapons, their food, and the cabin's defenses. His mind raced, running through every scenario, every possibility. Matthew, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of the stress, the way his hands trembled when he reached for his rifle, the way he jumped at every noise. It wasn't just the storm outside that was unsettling, it was the uncertainty of what lay beyond their door. Simon had no intention of abandoning the cabin, but every creak in the wind, every gust of snow against the walls, made him question his decision. He had fought to make this place a home, to carve out a life in the wilderness, and now it felt like that very wilderness was closing in on him. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. It was late in the evening when the sound came again. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the snow. It was something else, a low guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable scraping sound against the logs of the cabin. Simon's heart skipped a beat. This time it was different. The creature was closer, almost as though it had learned the weaknesses of their defenses. The scraping continued, rhythmic and patient, as though the creature was testing the strength of the cabin. Simon stood, rifle in hand, his body taut with readiness. He motioned for Matthew to stay behind him, to remain out of sight. They had to remain silent, invisible. The creature was clever, and Simon couldn't afford to give it any advantage. Slowly, he approached the door, listening intently to the sounds outside. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the walls. Simon's chest tightened. It was like the creature knew exactly where he was, where Matthew was. The scraping stopped, and there was silence. Complete, unnerving silence. Simon's fingers clenched around the rifle. It was almost as if the creature was waiting for something just outside the door, anticipating their next move. He couldn't stay here forever. He had to act. Suddenly, there was a heavy thud, followed by the sound of claws raking against the door. Simon didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and aimed for the door, ready to fire at the first sign of danger. The bear, or whatever it was, had finally made its move. The cabin was deathly silent as Simon's heart pounded in his chest. The rifle was aimed at the door, but his eyes darted back and forth between the locked door and the small window. The creature was outside, close enough to be heard, its weight pressing against the door as it scratched and scraped with growing desperation. Simon could hear the deep growls vibrating through the walls, almost as though it was testing its strength, measuring the vulnerability of the structure. Matthew crouched low in the corner, clutching his rifle, his breath shallow. Simon could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been building since the first time the creature had circled the cabin. Matthew had been quiet, too quiet since that first night. Now his fear was palpable, and Simon couldn't help but wonder if the man would be able to pull through this. He had only known Matthew for a few days, but in the wilderness, that was all that mattered. They had to survive. The scraping continued, and Simon's grip on the rifle tightened. He could feel the cold creeping in, seeping through the cracks in the cabin, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the anticipation of what was coming next. Would the creature break through? Would they be able to hold it off long enough to make a run for it? Or was this the end of their story? The door groaned under the weight of the creature, and Simon's mind raced. The door had been reinforced. He had spent hours making sure it would withstand the force of anything the wilderness could throw at it. But the creature outside wasn't just any animal. It was something different. Something smarter, more dangerous. Simon had no illusions now. The creature wasn't just testing their defenses. It was learning, adapting. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. Simon held his breath. Was it gone? Had it moved on? His eyes flicked to the window, but the blizzard outside made it impossible to see clearly. The silence stretched on, and for a moment Simon wondered if they had been forgotten, if the creature had lost interest. But then the door shuddered violently, as though something had struck it with all its force. The wood splintered at the edges, and the hinges groaned under the pressure. Simon's heart raced again. The beast was stronger than he had anticipated. It was only a matter of time before the door gave way. He raised his rifle higher, positioning himself for the moment the door would break. Matthew remained crouched, frozen in place. Simon knew that if they didn't act soon, the creature would force its way inside. He had to make a decision, and fast. The door cracked, a deep split forming where the creature's claws had raked through the wood. Simon could see the light of the fire flicker in the reflection of the splintered door, casting jagged shadows across the room. The beast was closer now than ever before, its growl vibrating through the walls. Simon's grip on the rifle tightened as he silently cursed his situation. It had been a mistake to stay. He had underestimated the wilderness, the danger that lurked outside, and now they were paying the price. Matthew's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But Simon could see something else too, a flicker of determination. The man was terrified, but he was still standing. He still had fight left in him. That was something Simon would need. "Get ready," Simon whispered, his voice low but steady. The door creaked again, the wood buckling under the relentless force. Simon could see the sharp, clawed hands now pressing through the gap, testing their strength against the structure. It was only a matter of time before the door gave way completely. The creature's growl rumbled louder, a primal, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Simon's spine. It was Clothos, too close. Simon moved quickly, positioning himself near the door, rifle trained on the space where he knew the creature's head would be. The plan was simple: shoot when the beast was within range, before it could overpower them. It was risky, but it was their only chance. The door buckled again, this time with a deafening crack. Simon's breath caught in his throat. There it was, the creature's massive form, dark fur, and piercing eyes suddenly visible through the broken door. Time seemed to slow as Simon raised his rifle. Every instinct told him to fire, but something held him back. They had one shot, one chance. They couldn't afford to miss. The creature's eyes locked onto his, its breath heavy and ragged. Simon's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out, and the wilderness held its breath. The deafening crack of the rifle echoed through the cabin as Simon squeezed the trigger. The blast shook the walls, but the creature, massive, wild, and relentless, did not falter. For a moment time stood still. The blur of its movements was all Simon could see, a flash of dark fur and sharp claws, and then, the instant before the chaos broke loose, it stopped. The shot had hit its mark. Simon knew it, the rifle had been true. But the beast didn't go down. For a heartbeat, Simon stood frozen, his finger still poised on the rifle's trigger, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature's eyes glinted with something more than fury, something far darker, a knowing intelligence. It didn't roar in pain or retreat as Simon had hoped. It simply stared at him, its massive body swaying slightly, seemingly unshaken by the bullet that had struck it. Matthew gasped behind him, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not dead." Simon didn't need to hear it. The beast was still standing, its claws digging into the splintered doorframe as it slowly, deliberately advanced. Its growls filled the cabin, low and menacing, as it pressed its massive weight against the door, inching ever closer. Simon's breath caught in his throat. It had taken the shot and kept coming. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for everything. "Stay back," Simon warned Matthew, his voice low and steady. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to scare this creature off. They had no time left to hesitate. Simon's pulse quickened, and without thinking, he moved closer to the door, his rifle now aimed directly at the creature's head. He knew he had no other choice but to press forward. This was their only chance. If they missed this shot, if the creature broke through the door, all would be lost. The moment stretched out, the growls and the crackling fire the only sounds in the cabin, until finally the creature lunged. It came at them with terrifying speed, claws slashing through the air, teeth bared in a ferocious snarl. Simon fired again, the rifle kicking in his hands. The second shot found its target. The creature staggered, its body twisting unnaturally as it faltered in its advance. But it didn't fall. It roared in fury, slamming against the door with even more force, now intent on breaking through the wood. Simon had never seen anything like this. A creature so determined, so unstoppable. But now Simon knew something vital. It was weakening, and that meant they had one final opportunity. The beast's roar reverberated through the walls, a primal cry that sent a jolt of fear down Simon's spine. But this time, it was different. There was an edge to the sound, a hint of desperation in the growl. It was no longer the confident testing movements of a predator. It was the frustrated, painful sounds of a creature on the edge of collapse. Simon took a step back, his heart racing. The beast had taken 2 shots now, both finding their mark. It was slowing, weakening, but Simon knew it wasn't over yet. It was only a matter of time before the creature would either retreat or come at them with everything it had left. His hand gripped the rifle tighter, and his mind raced through his options. "Matthew," Simon whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos that swirled inside him. "We need to hold on. Stay close." Matthew didn't answer. Simon could see the fear in his eyes, but also a flicker of something else, a resolve. The wilderness had tested them both in ways they hadn't anticipated, and yet they had survived. This was the final test, and neither of them could afford to falter now. The growls from outside became more frantic, more erratic. The creature was pacing back and forth, battering against the door with renewed fury, its claws scraping against the weakened wood. Every strike reverberated through the cabin, each blow threatening to tear the structure apart. Simon felt the door shift slightly, the hinges groaning under the pressure. It was happening. The creature was going to break through. "Get ready," Simon said, his voice low, sharp with the urgency of the moment. He adjusted his stance, rifle aimed at the door once again. They couldn't let the beast breach their defenses. The cabin had held firm so far, but that wouldn't be enough if they didn't act decisively. Suddenly, the door splintered. The beast's clawed paw reached through the gap, slashing wildly at the air. Simon fired. Another shot, his hand steady as he aimed for the exposed creature. The shot struck home, but this time the creature didn't retreat. Instead, it pushed forward harder, determined to get through at all costs. Simon's heart pounded in his chest. The rifle was the only thing between him and certain death. The creature's snarls filled the room, drowning out everything else. It was now or never. "Matthew, stay back!" Simon shouted, his voice filled with authority. The creature lunged again, but this time Simon wasn't waiting for it to strike first. He fired one final decisive shot. The silence that followed was deafening. The crackle of the fire seemed distant, muffled by the thumping in Simon's chest. He couldn't believe it. His hands trembled as the rifle lowered, his body still coiled with tension. The creature had fallen back, its body slamming against the door with a final sickening thud. The growling had ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Simon didn't lower his guard, not yet. He waited, listening intently for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The creature had collapsed. It had stopped moving. Matthew was still crouched behind Simon, wide-eyed and silent. Simon could hear him breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each anxious breath. They had made it through the worst of it. They had survived the creature's relentless assault. Simon moved cautiously toward the door, rifle at the ready. He knew that even in death, the creature could still pose a threat. Slowly, he peered through the cracks of the door, his eyes searching for any sign of the beast. But there was nothing. The storm outside had stopped, and the wilderness, for a fleeting moment, seemed eerily still. The door creaked open with a quiet groan, revealing the scene outside. The creature lay motionless, its massive body sprawled in the snow. Blood stained the ground, but there was no movement. Simon let out a long, controlled breath, his shoulders sagging with the release of tension. It was over. But as Simon stood there, rifle still in hand, staring at the beast that had terrorized them, a part of him couldn't shake the thought, what else had the wilderness been hiding? What else had it kept in the shadows, waiting for them to let their guard down? The mountains were quiet now, but Simon knew that peace in the frontier was fragile, fleeting. The storm had passed, but the wilderness always had its own way of testing those who dared to call it home. Weeks passed since the battle with the creature, and though the immediate danger had subsided, the wilderness had become an even more intimidating force. It was as if the mountain itself had been watching them, learning from them, waiting for the next trial to push them to the limit. The storm that had once raged relentlessly had calmed, but the air felt charged with a quiet tension, a sense that something was yet to come. Simon moved. Through the familiar motions of survival, checking traps, hunting the few remaining deer that had weathered the winter, and fortifying the cabin against whatever nature might throw at them next. The creature was gone, perhaps driven off by their persistence, perhaps simply retreating into the vast wilderness to recover. But Simon couldn't help but feel that the threat hadn't truly passed. The land wasn't done with them. The mountain had a way of testing those who dared to carve a life from its wildness, and he knew it wasn't done with him yet. Matthew, too, had grown quieter over time. His hands no longer trembled as they once had, but there was a look in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He had learned to respect the land's power, to understand that the wilderness was not just a backdrop to their lives, it was a living, breathing force that shaped their every move. Matthew had seen the creature's relentless pursuit, the way it seemed to study them, understand them, and adapt. That knowledge had shaken him to his core. It had shaken them both. Simon could feel it. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding that survival here wasn't a given. It wasn't something you could rely on simply because you had a roof over your head or a rifle in your hand. It was a constant struggle, a fight against the land itself, against the animals, the weather, and the unknown dangers that lurked just out of sight. It was a fight that never ended. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Simon sat by the fire inside the cabina. The flames flickered and danced, casting their warmth over the small room. Matthew was across from him, silently cleaning his rifle, his gaze distant. The quiet between them was heavy, filled with the weight of what had happened, what they had survived, and what lay ahead. "It's strange," Matthew said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but tinged with a sense of realization. "You think you've made it. You think you've conquered the land, but it's never over, is it?" Simon didn't answer right away. He knew what Matthew meant. The frontier had a way of testing you, pushing you to the brink and then retreating, only to return when you least expected it. The land had no mercy, no rest, no guarantees. One moment it would be peaceful, and the next you'd be fighting for your life again. "No," Simon said finally, his voice steady. "It's never over. It just changes." Matthew nodded slowly, as if the weight of those words had settled in him. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was a true one. They had won the first battle, but the war was ongoing. The wilderness was never finished with its trials. Simon looked out the small window, his gaze drifting across the snow-covered landscape. The mountains stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks piercing the sky. They were beautiful, awe-inspiring, but also ruthless. The silence outside was so deep it felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. The thought lingered in Simon's mind. What else was out there? What other dangers were lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to make their presence known? He couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. It was a quiet pressure, but it was ever-present. There was no escaping it. "We've got a good spot here," Simon said after a long pause, turning back to Matthew. "The cabin's strong. We've got enough supplies. But we need to keep moving, keep our heads on a swivel. This place can turn on you fast." Matthew didn't say anything. He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of Simon's words. They had become a team in the truest sense, surviving together, learning together, growing stronger together. But the mountain didn't care about their bond. It didn't care if they were ready. It didn't care if they had built a fortress. The land would continue to throw its challenges their way, and it would do so with a cold, indifferent cruelty. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He didn't know what, but he could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just the mountain watching them anymore. It was something deeper, something older. The wilderness had a rhythm, a pulse, and Simon knew, sooner or later, it would strike again. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the pale light of the sun casting long shadows over the snow. Simon rose early, his body still sore from the constant strain of survival, but his mind sharp as ever. Matthew was already up, tending to the fire. The silence between them had become less uncomfortable over the past few weeks, but it was still thick with the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time. After a quick breakfast, Simon set out to check the traps. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the earth beneath, but the ground was still frozen in places, making it difficult to move quickly. He adjusted his rifle, keeping it close. There was no telling what could be out there, waiting. The traps had been set in the usual spots, near the streams and the tree line where animals frequently passed. The first few traps yielded nothing but empty snare wires, but Simon wasn't discouraged. It had been a slow season, and the wildlife in the area was beginning to thin out as they adjusted to the changing weather. As he reached the third trap, he noticed something strange. The snow around it had been disturbed, scraped away, as if something had been digging or searching around it. Simon crouched down, inspecting the area carefully. The ground was soft here, but there were no clear tracks. No sign of the usual predators, bears, wolves, or even deer. But then Simon saw it, small clawed marks near the trap. Not animal tracks, but something else. Something that didn't belong. His pulse quickened as his mind raced. The creature, the one that had attacked them, was it back? Simon took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't afford to panic. He needed to be calm, focused. He moved quickly, retracing his steps back to the cabin, his senses on high alert. By the time he arrived, the cabin was quiet, but Simon knew better than to assume everything was fine. He entered the cabin with caution, rifle raised. Matthew was sitting by the fire, but his expression was distant, unfocused. "Matthew!" Simon called, his voice low and tense. "Something's wrong." Matthew looked up, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Simon stepped forward, his gaze hard. "The tracks, it's not over." Matthew stood up quickly, his eyes scanning the room. "Are you sure? You think it's the same creature?" Simon didn't answer right away. The thought of facing that monster again filled him with a sense of dread, but he couldn't let fear control him. They would face it, whatever it was, together. "We'll be ready," Simon said quietly. "We have to be." The cabin had been a fortress against the storm, against the wilderness, but Simon knew the true test was still ahead. The mountain wasn't done with them yet, and this time it wouldn't be the storm they had to survive.